Hello, and welcome back to OLLI's 2024 at the U Speaker Series. I'm Laura Peterson. This At the U series comes to you from the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota. OLLI is a learning community for people 50 plus who are curious lifelong learners. We offer hundreds of non-credit courses a year, plus other ways to get involved, like special interest groups and volunteer opportunities. I want to extend a warm welcome again to our OLLI members who are on this webinar, as well as our guests, and a thank you to our sponsors, AARP Minnesota and the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. We acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work, as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. Today's presentation is titled Dynamic Design in Everyday Objects. Our guest speaker is Dr. Jean McElvain has a master's degree in architecture and a PhD in apparel studies from the University of Minnesota. She is the full-time curator for the Goldstein Museum of Design, where she applies her deep understanding of many facets of 19th and 20th century design to identify relationships between everything from fashion to architecture. She regularly uses her exhibition curation and design to tell stories and guide research. Dr. McElvain, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you everyone for having me here today. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So I'm here to talk a little bit today about the background of the Goldstein Museum of Design, and then I'll also talk about some objects in particular from our collection as we get through the end of kind of a preview of who we are and what we do. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, our main collections and gallery space are actually on the St. Paul campus at the University of Minnesota. But we do have some space over in Minneapolis as well, which I'll tell you about. So today's Goldstein Museum is, of course, the result of many people's work, but its original collection began with the namesakes of the museum, Harriet and Vetta Goldstein. They were scholars, they were sisters, who both began teaching at the University of Minnesota in the early 1900s. And their philosophy was deeply rooted in the arts and crafts movement, which means that it really stressed the interrelationships between aesthetics and life. I'm truly believing that, quality life was based on quality design, which led to general personal betterment. So, in the time frame that they worked, there were, 2 world wars, a depression, and they educated thousands of women during that time, predominantly women here at the university. They also wrote a textbook called Art in Everyday Life, which had 4 or 5 publications, which was used for decades across the nation. It was really one of the first related arts textbooks available at that time. Both scholars believe deeply in the value of object-based learning, and we try to carry that forward today. That's still somewhat unusual. So they were really ahead of their times thinking about what it meant for students to interact with design objects. In 1925, they took a world tour, largely to seek out global design objects. They certainly believed in design as a global practice. This is a travel map from their journal, and you can still see the kind of green highlight from where they marked their route. They wrote an extensive travel journal that they compiled into a bound volume when they returned. But I just can't imagine what it was like to carry trunks and typewriters and reams of paper and all of this with them as they went on this, world tour. Here is a page from one of their, from the journal from Indonesia, and they often made kind of a scrapbook collage of different things that they picked up. So you can see that they've pasted in a picture from a postcard at the bottom there. And there is a batik sampler that they purchased in Indonesia at that time. And, you know, something like this, seeing a sampler from a part of the world where, you know, batik is known as absolutely expert in this part of the world, it would have been quite a boon for students to see firsthand back in the 30s, when you really didn't have, you know, you couldn't Google what this looked like. So it was a really rich resource for people to be able to see up close. When McNeil Hall expanded in the 1970s, space was allocated for a gallery and collection storage spaces. The Goldstein had been positioned within the College of Human Ecology up until 2006, which was, of course, previously the College of Home Economics. But at that time in 2006, the College of Human Ecology merged with the College of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. And so the Goldstein switched from being under the Department of Design, Housing, and Apparel to being under the college, which is where it is now situated. We have 2 gallery spaces. HGA Gallery is in Rapson Hall, and Rapson Hall is a Minneapolis campus and houses largely the disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, and product design and interior design. The gallery over here is in a main atrium space, which is really problematic for showing objects. It's not secure. These shows tend to focus on disciplines that are coming out of the building, or that are housed there in Rapson Hall, and are often co-curated or often solely curated by faculty. So in the museum, we have a common practice of having faculty and student curators work on shows. Our other exhibition space, our main gallery, is in McNeil Hall. And this is our secure gallery, so we do feature collections-based shows here, but we also feature shows with borrowed objects as well, so they don't always have collection objects in them. We have, 5 main collecting areas: textiles, decorative arts, product design, and graphic design. And we do have over 35,000 objects, and almost 20,000 of those are in the area of costume, with 5,000 in textiles, 3,000 in decorative arts, and less in product design and graphic design. Product design for the college is a relatively new discipline, and we are starting to try to collect to kind of meet the curricular needs of some of these disciplines, and the way that existing disciplines have changed over time. So all of these pieces are stored in many spaces around McNeil Hall, and this requires, an ongoing effort. Your collection spaces are never done, and so we're constantly going through and trying to find better ways to store things, as well as try to make space for new things. We do have, as I mentioned on the slide here, I should mention it verbally too, we have a donor-based collecting practice, meaning that almost everything that we have has been gifted to us. We do not have a large acquisition budget per se. We have dress objects that date back to the late 1700s, but it is far more common for us to have garments from kind of the post-Civil War era up and through about the 1980s or 90s. Of course, we have outliers on both sides of that, but that is where the bulk of our collection sits. And we attempt to gain depth in kind of all of the eras. These 2 dresses are essentially from the same era, but of course we collect deeply within this era so that we can see different, nuances, different making techniques, different price points, different kind of uses of garments, etc. So it's quite an involved collecting practice. Much of our collection is made up of special occasion garments, which I'm sure you can all kind of guess why that would be. This is, mostly because that's what people tend to keep. So since we're a receptive museum, it's very unlikely for us to get day dresses and house dresses prior to about 1950, partly because people, wore them and used them up too. Here are two kind of house dresses from, the 1930s and 20s. And I'm sure I pulled a catalog image from Sears here to correspond with the 1920s house dress. This would have been quite a common type of thing to wear while doing chores. So it's good for us to have pieces like this to show students and the public, because our collection, as Harriet and Vetta's kind of tenets, as well as what we work on, that design in everyday life is not just about that exalted few designers. It's partly about that, but it's also about how people use things every day. Part of what makes up that big number of collection items in the apparel area is all of the accessories. We have thousands of fashion-related accessories, from scarves and gloves and handbags and hats and compacts, petticoats, parasols, just a wide range of things that support how we look every day. The Goldstein has about 950 pairs of shoes, which were rehoused in individual object carriers in archival cabinets about 10 years ago. Prior to this, they were sitting, kind of on a shelf. But shoes are particularly problematic in storage. They have a lot of adhesives. A lot of them are made from materials that degrade over time, like natural rubbers. And so this project took a lot of time through volunteer help, as well as, a grant through IMLS to get done, but it's been really a benefit for us and the people who study our collection. We also have a large international collection. We have about 2,500 pieces of world dress. This collection expanded significantly in around 2006. The International Institute of Minnesota, which is located up on Como Avenue, is an organization that helps ostensibly immigrants who are trying to logistically get settled here once they move. And part of what they did used to be the Festival of Nations, which took place in downtown St. Paul. And they would often be gifted these costumes from different parts of the world. So they didn't know what to do with them anymore. And so we did accession hundreds of them. And many of them contain, very heritage crafts that are kind of quintessentially from the region which they hark from. They're so highly regional as well that it's kind of, so interesting to study them, because you can identify exact villages from where different pieces came. As I said, we do have a decorative arts / product design collection, which, when the Goldstein sisters started, they really collected more in a survey way. So it's a really eclectic collection without singular depth in a lot of, in any one area. We have a considerable mid-century chair collection, although, it's about 50 to 60 pieces, which we've used with interior design many times. You can see there's a Walkman down there on the lower right. And it's so interesting, if I show that Walkman to young students, they have no idea what it is, because tape technology is, of course, completely foreign to them. So it's interesting how things that I certainly recognize from, my life are completely obsolete now, to the point where they're unrecognizable. We tend to have a fairly large area of studio pottery as well. We have an extensive textile collection that has both global technique and a lot of manufacturing techniques or idiosyncrasies. These two pieces here, the one on your left is from West Africa. It's a fold dye, and you could probably tell it's from the 1970s. And but it's such an excellent example that I sometimes show classes on, technique and how exacting the accordion folding is on that piece. West Africa, again, known for fabric ornamentation. So this is a great example of that. And then on the right is a piece by Henrietta Reese, who was a well-known designer, as well-known as, textile designers are in the 30s and 40s. Also, that's a screen print piece. As I was mentioning, our collection is built on donors, and this is quite a large part of what I do, and it's actually a really time demanding part of what I do. A lot of people have pieces that they're interested in donating. So I might review anywhere between, 800 to 3,000 pieces per year, depending on the kind of calls I get, and try to figure out, if we have the space to add those to our collection. People often ask me, what are you looking for specifically? And it's just so hard with a collection like design to really identify, other than, there's some seminal pieces that we'd like. It's very difficult to kind of put your arms around. So I usually have kind of a list of conditions like, we want objects in good condition. We don't have conservation funds, for example. So it's hard for us to take in pieces that need a lot of work. Supplemental information. I won't read through all of these, but, just to give people an idea, when they ask me what we're looking for, it doesn't mean that at any one time there might not be an outlier that surprises me and delights me, and fits well with what our mission is. It's so much easier for me to say what we have a lot of and don't really need. I can't tell you how many people want to give us their wedding dresses. We have so many from each era that it's really hard to add those, or being, I'm continually more and more picky in that area, just because we have such a huge amount of them. One great thing about collecting wedding dresses is the provenance. It has, usually, the exact date it was worn. You usually have a picture of the person wearing it. So there are so many benefits to, an ensemble like this. Stockings and hosiery. It's amazing how many people have kept silk stockings from the 1930s, 40s, 50s. We have about 300 pairs of them. Petticoats, again, I swear everybody in their basement has a box with some petticoats, an old pair of gloves, and a hat from 1935, because those are the kind of things I see over and over again. So it's just interesting. And I think why you see them over and over again is because they're interesting and they have beautiful details that people have a really hard time divesting of. Over the past, few years, we have had a small acquisition budget that is, I use quite sparingly. When I served as interim director for a few years, and during that time, I did earmark that acquisition budget towards, underrepresented communities, and trying to collect design from BIPOC individuals, both contemporary, but also historically. That tends to be a gap in our collection. These two pieces are contemporary. One is by Delina White, who is Ojibwe, and had this dress for sale, and I talked with her, and she was very happy to have us include it. So that was a lovely purchase. And then also a poster from Juxtaposition Arts, which came out in 2020. And Juxtaposition Arts is a great, vibrant place for young designers to kind of get some practice and tutelage and work on their craft. So this is a screen printed poster. Over the past 12 years, we've been working on photographing the collection. One thing that became so apparent to me during the pandemic was that if we didn't have an object photographed, to anybody. We just didn't have access to it. Even staff were removed from collections during that time. So it's become so immediately apparent how critical photographing the collection is. This is our photography project when it first started. It's a very labor-intensive process, and the project has been funded intermittently by IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences, and it's a project we can't do without grant funding. And so we were given this very small space for a photo studio that you see on your left. In fact, our photographer had to back up out of the studio to take this picture because there wasn't enough room to get the full mannequin in the shot while his chair was in the room. So, you know, there are a lot of logistical issues with biting off a project like this. We have currently about 30% of our collection photographed. We are funded right now through IMLS, but certainly have had ups and downs in that. And you really get a lot of, it hinders your progress to stop and start a project like that because you have to hire people, and it'd be much easier if it was ongoing, I guess is what I'm saying. But it's just one of those things that we kind of, it's not that we're looking to achieve, you know, 100% of the collection photograph necessarily, but certainly our goal is to keep going on that. Here's our preparator working with the photographer. You know, each object, of course, has to be taken with one record of its catalog number along with the color card so that that could be matched at a later time if necessary. And something like, you know, there's a huge variety to how much time it takes something to get prepped for photography. So here are the wedding dress on the left, and in the center, a garment like that, that's from the 1950s, it might take 8 hours to prep. It has a lot of fabric, and it's been in a box or closet, so it's fairly you know, compressed. So it will take a while to prepare it. Whereas the dress on the right might take 20 minutes. I mean, it's from the 1920s. It has preset pleats, which we can't add any steam or heat to, otherwise they'll get destroyed. So there's an average in there somewhere between 20 minutes and 8 hours. In the summer, we sometimes have access to higher ceiling spaces, which is often when we do bigger objects like big gowns or chairs or something that really needs a little space around it. So this is, for example, if you found this garment in our closet in the Goldstein, it would look like it was in very sad condition. So preparing an object like this requires a lot of skill. So I just have an incremental, you know, view of this getting dressed. Our preparator starts with a very rudimentary old form. I bet that form dates to, you know, maybe 1940. It's been around this building forever. And it's much easier to have forms that are too small than too big because you can build them up. We don't use historic bustles when we dress an object because it would compromise their integrity. So we've made facsimiles out of those with patterns. So here's the bustle, but you can see it doesn't quite operate the same as a bustle from that era would. So she's had to, you know, bolster it up with some bat on the front of it. And now she's adding a little more support behind as well. And then over that, she's pinning a petticoat to the front. So when the dress falls, it doesn't cut off where that bat cuts off. And then she adds a petticoat over the whole thing to kind of pin up to smooth it out. But then the top isn't quite right. You know, it's too long-waisted really for this historic garment. So she has to start padding out the top part as well. And here she is putting this jacket on. You can see the way that it's being dressed. It still barely fits. That bodice, you can see part of the underskirt coming out beneath it. But here in the back is assembling the bustle, of course. So it's just a very labor-intensive process to get. I mean, in the closet, as I said, this dress looks, you know, like nothing. But once you get it dressed and on a form, it looks quite beautiful and how it's supposed to look. And something like this, which you don't think about, we take shoe photographs as well. And for something like a sandal, simple enough. And yet, if you don't have a foot in it, those straps fall down and get all wonky. So she's kind of added some monofilament during the photography, which then our photographer has to go back in post-production and take out in Photoshop. And all of these, of course, have to have metadata that matches the parameters of our database as well. So it becomes a very a complex project quickly. But you can see it's worth it. The pictures on the left in each of these sets are ones that I took for presentations before we had any photography project. And then the ones on the mannequins are ones that our team has taken, which provide a much more accurate view of the garments and the designer's intent. We do use photographs sometimes in exhibitions as well as online. We did an exhibition in 2017 called Inside Her Clothes, which looked at the technical contributions of people who make garments. Those are often such overlooked and undervalued skills. So kind of showing some pieces fully inside out to call attention to the design details. And then we were able to show the garments, right side out, full scale on vinyl stuck to the back of the wall. Like here's a close-up of this. So you really get to see how complicated something is when it's put together. We do have a virtual community. I mean, as I said, that just is something that even, prior to the pandemic, have been growing. It's just an expectation with young people that we will have objects available online for them to look at. And so you're kind of always fighting between wanting to make sure the object stays really central to what we do, because we're an object-based teaching museum, and being able to provide, a two-dimensional view of it via a screen. We have social media accounts, and we sometimes are able to share pictures with other distributors as well. On the lower right there is an image from Bloomsbury Fashion Central, which is a publishing house in the UK, which has a strong focus on fashion and design. And so we had a deal with them to share 500 of our images with them. And that was from a few years ago, but they're still available there as kind of just a collective storehouse of images from many different institutions. We, of course, as I said, want to make sure that the objects remain primary, and do use them with students in classes, as well as, of course, through exhibitions. So here we have, graduate students and undergraduate students from the theater department and from the College of Design here, looking at garments in different ways, whether it's through, a cultural lens, although arguably all of it's seen through a cultural lens, or a more technical approach or historical approach. There's so much to learn from the objects themselves. One thing that I always like to talk about, or that I always like to include in a donation, is photographs, if possible. So a garment, or the way that we dress, the garment is just one part of that. You really need to see the full assemblage to understand the cultural context of something. So like this dress, I knew this woman's daughter, who was, a grown woman when she was in her 50s when she brought me this garment, which had been her mother's. And I knew it had been worn for a second wedding, but just seeing the pictures provide such a different view of it to me. And I think it's so much more beneficial for students to see that complete picture. Now, of course, we only get pictures for about 5% of the garments that we take in, but I always ask. Likewise, here are some on the left here is a little red suit. You can also see it worn by someone second from the right. And the woman who gave me this has done this exhaustive job of trying to gift objects of her mother's and finding photographs to support that of historic photographs of her mother wearing these things. It's not common to have somebody take that much time and care to do that. So we have this kind of lovely history of this woman's dress from when she was quite a young woman to up until, she was not old, but older, in her 60s and 70s. And Min Jin Chen had given us this wardrobe of her mother's, as well of Chi Pao or Chung Sum. And, this is such a common garment type. And we really didn't, I was surprised that we really didn't have any representation of it when I went to look. So I think we took in around a dozen of these, and some of them did have pictures of her mother in them. And her mother lived in Hong Kong, but the style really comes, of course, from China in general. And during the Cultural Revolution, women were not allowed to wear these. So they become such a telling object about space, time, and politics. So now I'm going to just talk about a few more objects from our collection as kind of a hodgepodge of things, but just to give you kind of a general idea of some of how we look at pieces and use them. So this piece, we're actually not going to talk about the garment that's featured on the front of this slide, although it was part of this exhibition that you see from this 1983 catalog on the left. We'd been gifted with a fairly large collection of garments from this affluent family. This is well before my time here at the Goldstein. And you can see at the time from the quote there on the screen that somebody thought this to be, the single most important gift to the Goldstein's historical costume materials. And it did have a lot of beautiful pieces. This red and black vest that you see is made with jet beading, which is very unusual. And it was quite an elegant version of this kind of garment, even though it was a widely popular kind of garment. But here we have the advantage of seeing the garment worn as well as, and the garment. So at this time, we know that this garment was purchased in France and has a lot of hand embroidery on it. But in the photograph, we can see additional details that we don't see on the dress as we have it. For example, you can see that there's some kind of, silk flower up near one of the sleeves. But this picture also is important that it shows us how this bodice is worn. It's so kind of unusually cut with the different paneling that now we can see, without the photograph, we wouldn't know exactly how to style that on the form. So they become very instructive in that way. But also this is such a great example of kind of that Gibson girl aesthetic that was so popular at the turn of the century, where you have, this was a French dress, but the way this woman is wearing it certainly also has that assertive kind of Gibson girl, kind of American look that was popular at that time as well. Here's a close-up of, the bodice, and you can see the hand embroidery on it. And, if we were studying this dress, I would look at the material quality of the sequins, and they were likely an early celluloid material, which would have been a common way to make sequins at this time, a very early plastic. And details like the hem embroidery, there are kind of unique versions of floral around the hem, which shows kind of how individualistic and elegant or expensive a gown like this probably would have been. Now we also have this is part of our decorative arts collection, and you can see that these two pieces have kind of visual similarity. The last piece would have been categorized kind of coming out of that Art Nouveau era, which we can see in the way that the flora is handled. And similarly here, certainly at this point, these are both from around 1900, the same era as that dress. Certainly at this point, porcelain and glass can be made with precision, right? It could have a completely uniform look. So places like Wedgwood and Sevres had been in the business for over 200 years by now. So these pieces are clearly trying to appear more handmade through their ornamentation, design, and the glazing color choices. And that green glaze on the right hand, compote certainly evokes that Art Nouveau, arts and crafts era kind of styling. And then the piece on the left there is glass, but also has a highly patinaed look. So there is this searching for an aesthetic that is outside of machined perfection, even though at this point the Industrial Revolution would have made that highly possible. And so we see this style progression. I pulled a couple of objects here by Rookwood, and Rookwood was an American pottery located in Cincinnati, started by a woman actually, Maria Longworth Nichols. And at that time, around the late 1800s, it was kind of seen as acceptable pastime for affluent women to paint ceramics. And she became very interested in starting a business. And you can see that the vase on the left looks older. It looks a little fussier, but in fact, compared to what was going on at the time in Victorian design, it was quite progressive. Progressive use of design. Its flora is certainly detailed, it's not abstract, but it has a look that kind of moves it beyond its asymmetry. It moves it beyond straight Victorian design. But if you look at the ones on the right, the candlesticks, you can see how much in that 30 to 40 years, we have a much more Art Deco kind of design. These evoke more of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, who of course I don't know that he would be necessarily considered in that oeuvre, but it just has a much different look. And again, you see that matte glaze, which was so popular in the arts and crafts movement. So if you look at, for example, if you think of that last vase in comparison to Victorian design, you can see how much the one in the center has a more modern look than the one on the left. And Rookwood was quite exemplary in that early on in the late 1800s, it garnered a lot of attention at international expositions, which was not common for American potteries at that time. It gained a gold ribbon marking at one of them. So it really established itself as a high-end pottery, right away. And also coming out of that era, when we think of modernism, I like to look at our objects overlaying a lot of different social influences, not only design movements, but kind of what's going on at the time. The Barcelona chair might be something you recognize. To me, it looks so almost 1960s, but of course it was designed in 1929 by Mies van der Rohe for the International Exposition in Barcelona. It was designed for the German Pavilion, which you can see an interior photograph of there that I've pulled with his chairs in the foreground. But it makes this kind of beautiful entry into steel furniture, which is more synonymous with international style, with the Bauhaus, so it has this kind of hard edge, and yet it has this soft curving to it that gives it, a less hard edge. And if we compare that to a contemporaneous French dress of the time. You can see, that there are similarities with the treatment of black and white in the dress, very kind of modernist moves, as well as these light curves that kind of touch around the figure in the same way that the Van der Rohe chair kind of sits up nicely from the ground. So I'm always trying to find some kind of cohesion or disparateness between objects as I'm working with students or the public. This was a collage I pulled together on Art Deco design. It combines obviously both pieces from, and the two vases down there in the left are not from our collection, but the bowl and handkerchief and earrings are. And if you saw that lace handkerchief sitting out, you wouldn't think of it as Art Deco at all. But if you start to kind of pull apart some of the elements, you can see a lot of similarity in time and space of design influence. Another thing that we use quite a bit with students are textiles, and two pieces like this to me are great at discussing different making techniques through different eras. So one is from the 1876 exposition in Philadelphia, a souvenir scarf. And souvenir scarves, I think everyday objects like this tell us so much about life. It's not a particularly lionized part of our culture, souvenir wear, but something like this tells quite a bit. And then on the right there is home furnishing fabric that was developed in the 1950s. They both attempt to give off a look of something, of a production process that somewhat belies the production process. So if you look closely at the exposition scarf, you can see a lot of minor stippling, and that was likely produced through offset lithography at that time. But it's certainly made to look more like a copper plate kind of etching or print. Whereas the one on the right from the 1950s is screen printed, but is certainly made to look either like offset lithography or a copper plate print. So when we're trying to recreate these kind of nostalgic methods, you kind of lose fidelity as you move along in terms of overall effect. This is a piece by Ruth Reeves, and it's from a series called the Hudson River series. And you might be able to tell that it is from the 1940s. And screen printing was something that really allowed a lot of designers to be more experimental in pattern and motif. And at this time, it really was burgeoning, kind of in this interwar World War II era. To make a textile print in the 1800s usually required some kind of roller print. And that means you have to have a machined metal kind of canister with a print. It's a very expensive process, whereas something like screen print you can do much less expensively. So you get these kind of art prints. But one early problem with screen printing was registration, meaning that it was very hard to get the screens to line up exactly perfectly. But here, Ruth Reeves has done this beautiful job of making intentionally off-registered design, so that, for example, the tree in the close-up looks like it has this little light white shadow that outlines it, which is an intentional work at misregistration to kind of bring life to this rather complex pattern design. We also have many pieces from the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which I'm sure many of you know came out of the 1930s and Depression era. At its peak in 1938, it employed over 3 million people. And we often think of the WPA as sponsoring projects like the Hoover Dam or large infrastructure projects, but they also worked on forming design collectives for surface fabric design. And out of Milwaukee, there was one group, largely women, who created different motifs in kind of pattern books, which you could then go in and select one and they could make a larger run of fabric for you. So here are a few samples from the many pattern books that we have. And here's a workroom showing many of the women working in this on this kind of project. This is a piece by Virginia Lee Burton, and some of you may know her as a children's book writer and illustrator, Mike Mulligan or The Little House. But, you know, she also started this collective called Folly Cove Designers out east. And Folly Cove was a collective of women who did textile design largely through linoleum block print. And if on the left you can see that larger run of fabric, you can, you know, kind of see where that linoleum block repeated. But this is such a great example for students of how much movement and how much dynamism you can get with a single color when you're working on design. So often, you know, you're trying to think of an elaborate color palette, and this is such a, you know, a nice way to show how you can make the most out of a single color. We also happen to have this huge collection of scarves by a designer named Vera Newman. I'm sure many of you had Vera scarves or had mothers or grandmothers with Vera scarves. Quite famously, Marilyn Monroe draped one around her for a photo shoot. But, you know, Vera Newman was born and raised in New York City. And the story is when she was growing up that her father would, she was always bored. So her father would agree to pay her 25 cents for every sketchbook that she could fill. So often we have a class that works on two-dimensional design. Every semester come and the instructor and I pull a few scarves so that we can talk about pattern and repeat. And because part of what they do is create pattern and repeat. But I think, you know, one thing we talk about is the fact that Vera Newman started making designs in her kitchen in Manhattan. But it's not that everything she produces is so amazing, but she's just so prolific and she doesn't seem to stop to worry about mistakes. So in our collection, we have, I think, around 1,500 scarves by her. And there are some that are different colorways of the same pattern, but by and large, they are unique designs. She certainly had more people working with her over the years, but she was the progenitor of many of these, thousands of these designs. So for example, we'll show a scarf like this to the class to talk about trapping, which is what you see between two colors close up there. That trapping is where, as I was talking about before, when you're screen printing, you're trying to make sure you don't see any of the white fabric behind. And here she's used it as a, you know, a design element so that it creates this third color. We might talk about colorway with students and how that impacts your perception of these objects, makes you see them differently. Or we also might surmise, you know, how to be inspired by things you see in everyday life. So I don't know that Vera was inspired by stacking chairs and farmlands for these two scarves, but it certainly appears as though she was. So even something like a plain stacked chair might inspire a designer to make something. In terms of pattern, you know, pattern is such a funny thing in garments because for men, it really, unless it's a plaid, it doesn't exist. Of course, men's work shirts sometimes do branch into pattern, but the 70s act as kind of a foil to that narrative, and we have a lot more interest in men's dress in that in that era, people often ask us if we collect men's clothing, and we do, but so often what's offered to us are men's suits. And there are only so many Black men's suits you can take from each decade. So it's so nice to have a few things outside of that that really talk about menswear. Patterns too in pants are so unusual. I did a talk a few weeks ago for the Golden Valley Historical Society, and I forget, I must have been their 50th anniversary. So they wanted a talk on fashion from the 1970s. So it was really fun to dig in and explore all these different issues related to masculinity and femininity and the women's movement that were all kind of wrapped up in this era. Part of what that talk also addressed was the women's movement. And, this on the right here is a picture of a donor of ours, Vicki Gutenkopf, who gifted us with her Braniff Airline flight attendant ensembles, which you see in the center there, and then a promotional ad for them from the 60s on the left. And, if I show this to young people today, they can't believe that this and this was a flight attendant ensemble. I mean, there's really no precedent for shorts kind of being worn in the workplace. But of course, this was an era when male business travel was the focus of a lot of these airlines. And like I said, some of the students are horrified when I tell them that Vicki told me, she had to weigh in before each flight. And if she was even a pound over, she couldn't go. She had to go to charm school. She couldn't be married. There were all these kind of personal stipulations around working in the airlines at that time. Oh, and here's a picture from the 1970s. You can see just that huge shift from the hot pants to Holston, where things have just a totally different look. Now, to end with here, I pulled just a few images of teapots as a way to look at, how we might view materiality and form. A teapot is something that people often collect them. They become part of our lives. They have kind of a pleasing way about them. This teapot is quite old, from 1825, and it's from the French company Limoges. And I always find this one interesting because it looks like it's from metal, but of course it's porcelain with a luster glaze. So this would have been a time when, of course, tea services were popular, and it kind of carries that illusion a little bit, and has quite an unusual shape for 1825. Certainly looks like it is influenced by Asian design. Again, this is in 1912. This is a pounded copper teapot with a carved horn handle, and pounded copper was, again, very popular during the arts and crafts movement. It implied a certain amount of hand work, which was admired by some. As we all know, with handwork, you can rarely charge enough to actually make it worth the average consumer's while to make something like this. But of course, when something like this is made, people make casts of it, and then you can make facsimiles of pounded copper, which happened quite a bit in the American arts and crafts era, that you would have kind of faux pounded copper as a texture. And then much differently is Eva Zeisel for Castleton China Company in the 40s. And Eva Zeisel was, is a renowned potter, and this is really such a forward design for that era. She was asked to design a dinner service for the Museum of Modern Art, and was so tired of all the floral ornamentation that was typical on dinner services that she made this, white service that became incredibly timeless and popular. And then, of course, we have tea kettles like that of Michael Graves for OLLI. And then I just threw in here the Michael Graves for Target Corporation, because any of us living in the Twin Cities certainly remember Target's big collaboration with Michael Graves around 2000, where every homeware was designed kind of in this language. You could hardly buy a squeegee for your home that didn't have like a big blue handle. So this became incredibly iconic of the 2000s, and was kind of pushing on those ideas of postmodern design where things look somewhat frivolous. But of course, OLLI, which is an Italian company, had been doing that since the 1980s. Speaking of which, here is another teapot by Aldo Rossi for OLLI that also takes a much different form than we're used to seeing in a teapot. And when you compare that to something like this Warren Mackenzie teapot from the 1970s, you can see how much stylistic preference and making really factors into consumer demand and consumer interest. So ending on that, before I wrap up, I just want to mention that we have a couple of new exhibitions. Well, one's just closing, but this is relatively new. Firsthand, Contemporary Craft and Context opened on March 26th, and it's here in 241 McNeil Hall, and features crafts people from around the region. 5 different craftspeople are featured. One is a collective, the Boat Building Collective, which you see images of along the bottom there, looking at process and making technique. And then also we have The Soil and the Story, which is currently on view in Rapson Hall. There's a closing celebration for it on the 16th, although it closes on the 19th in a literal sense. But this looks at Black soil ship along down along the Black Belt, which is considered, you know, the southern part of the U.S. And one of the researchers, Tiffany Lachey, who's a self-proclaimed farmer, but also soil scientist, grad student, worked, you know, she acquired all of these soil samples from different farms, traveled all along the South to create this really, you know, remarkably beautiful look into farming, which is often kind of taken for granted as well. So we hope you'll come to those, and I'd love to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I really know very little about design other than what I like, but I don't know anything deeper than that. And so I was really struck by 2 things you said. One, that the quality of life is related to the quality of design. I just never thought of it that way, that good design can really improve my own quality of life. That was beautiful. And also so interesting to hear that clothing can be so, and design can be so powerful that it has to be banned by government, like the China example you gave. That was amazing to me. So thank you for that. So on to the questions. We have so many of them. Do you know if any students accompanied the Goldstein sisters on their world tour?
That's a great question. And I would have to say, I don't think so. They kept such an exacting journal that I can't imagine that wouldn't have been mentioned as part of their journal. I will say we have so many people come in and say, oh, my mother studied with the Goldsteins, or, oh, I mean, it's not uncommon at all. They must have made quite an impact, I understand. It's always so hard to kind of, when you show a picture of them, I'm sure students today think they look, you know, like old biddies. And so you're trying to like convey that they were quite revolutionary in their day and forward thinking. So students certainly loved working with them is what we hear, but I don't know that anybody accompanied them.
Okay. And along those lines, is it possible to view their journals?
Oh, that's a great question. What do I want to say? the hard copy, the real journal, is in our collection, and it's a little bit fragile, but there is a duplicate of it that certainly people could come and look at. But it's not online. I mean, ultimately, it'd be great to digitize it, but it's not online, so you'd have to come in to view it.
Okay. So lots of people have written in offering their treasures from their attics. So I'm wondering if there's a contact name or email that they could have, unless you'd rather not hear from anyone right now
No.
until you.
No, yes, that would be fine. You can contact me directly, and my email, I guess shall I put it in the chat, Laura?
Well, if you don't mind, that would,
Yeah.
Q&A. No,
Oh, Q&A?
wait, yes.
Okay.
No, maybe you just read it out. I don't think anyone can see the Q&A except
Okay.
the host.
Okay. Well, it's the letter of my first name, J, and then MCELVAI. So no N. They didn't give me the N. So it's just JMCELVAI@umn.edu. We're very small staffed. We have this huge collection, but we have our director is named Aidan O'Connor, and she just started this past fall. And then it's me in the curatorial role. And then we have a full-time registrar / installations person, Lorene. So we have a small staff. Sometimes it takes me a while to get back to people on donations, but I'm happy to field questions on that.
Perfect. I'm sure you'll hear from a lot of people. Are you able at all to provide direction for people who may have their own treasures at home that they wish to keep and display in some way, but that need restoring? Are there any local resources for that?
I'm sure there are. We currently have a grant to have 2 dresses conserved. And we're going through MAC, which is the Midwest Art Conservation Center. Now, the only way we can do that is through a grant. It's quite expensive to have things conserved. But that would be the premier resource in the center to do that. And they have experts in almost any object type, from textiles to paintings to, metals. So that's certainly, there might be other ways, though, depending on the object, that you could find somebody to help you with. There's a great place in the North Loop called Twisted Thread. There's a guy there named Dwayne, I forget his last name now, but he started that shop. But he washes historic garments and textiles, and he won't do anything that he feels like might be potentially damaging. So we've used him on some pieces before, and he'll give us an assessment. So that's another resource if you have things that you need cleaned. He's an expert at older fabrics.
Sounds like it might be pricey to do that, but worthwhile.
Yeah.
So one of our attendees said that she was fascinated by the shoes that you showed that had a platform heel that was clear on one side, but had different color squares on the other parts of the shoe. It reminded her of the 1960s mod style. And she was wondering if you could elaborate on the era that shoe was from, what it's made of, and how it was made.
I'm trying to think of which one that was.
Shoot.
I know. I know I can't remember, but any of those shoes, in the 1960s, there were shoes made with more plastics and acrylics. If you think, in fact, the airline attendant shoes that go with the crazy pattern outfit were made, the entire upper was made out of a clear plastic, which you think would be horribly uncomfortable for standing in as a flight attendant. But certainly that mod, that whole mod scene was such an interesting kind of precursor to the 70s, which took a total turn in the other direction, which fashion, of course, often does. But I think, in the mod era, plastics were becoming so popular. It was really before the consciousness of the 70s when people put a brake on it and said, wait a minute, why, what's with all the plastic? You can't get rid of it. And so you see so much of that. We have a lot of go-go boots that are vinyl from the 1960s that just are imploding because that kind of vinyl, plastic is one of those weird things where it lasts forever, but it doesn't last forever. Like it lasts forever, but it looks terrible after a while. Plastic is best new. It doesn't like acquire a beautiful patina over time. And so I'm sure a lot of shoes from the era did do experimental kind of dabbling with different adhesives and materials.
We are always fascinated by shoes.
I know. Yeah.
Okay, so now some broader questions. When did fashion design become a thing? Like in what era did people begin to make statements about themselves and their station in life through design?
I would argue that that's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. In terms of kind of American European society, people often credit Charles Frederick Worth as the father of couture. He was a British man who worked in the French fashion industry. And, people credit him with being one of the first designers to label his work. And the idea that the designer becomes somewhat of a quasi-celebrity comes out, I think, of that era, where you start to get clientele that is particularly high-end or wealthy, and then everybody wants to dress like them. And it kind of, that kept building momentum throughout the 20th century, really until you hit the 70s when street style kind of realigns that. And it's a time when now you have high-end designers copying the hippie styles instead of everybody trying to keep up with the high-end designers. But I think that's such a strong desire to, I find clothes so interesting because whether you care about them or not, you probably have to wear them. And whether you care to omit something wearing them or not, people probably read you a certain way by what you have on. And so you kind of see more study of that happening throughout the 20th century. But yeah, I think, the French fashion industry, they want to be still the ones that are kind of in charge of setting the standards for style. But of course, that's increasingly impossible to do with globalization. So we're really seeing some shifts, I think, there as well.
How did so many of those designers become so sought after? Yves Saint Laurent, Chanel, Schiaparelli. What made their designs so sought after?
Yeah, I would credit a lot of that to the French couture system, which really promoted a certain high-end type of garment. If you look at somebody like Christian Dior, who after World War II was kind of the designer to follow, with that kind of really tight waist and big skirt, and that style maintained throughout much of the 1950s. But we don't, and actually, he died quite suddenly, and Yves Saint Laurent took over his atelier when he was only 19 years old. It was crazy. But he didn't last there very long. I mean, he was gone off on his own by the 60s under his own name. But it's so hard to say what makes something sought after. A lot of it is the context. And the couture system for a long time kind of held those reins, and your involvement in it was highly dependent on meeting a number of parameters. So somehow you had to have benefactors. Of course, now so much of it is run by conglomerates that it operates much differently.
I'm sorry to go back a little bit, but could you please repeat your email one more time? There's a lot of people who just didn't get it written down in time.
Yeah, sure. It's JMCELV as in Victor, AI at umn.edu.
Perfect. Thank you. And someone in our group says that if the attendees are interested in hearing directly from the Goldstein Museum, there's a button on the homepage called Get Our Updates, which takes people directly to a newsletter sign up. So, so check out the Goldstein Museum, which is a somewhat long email address or a URL for me to read out, but I'm sure if you just Google Goldstein Museum, University of Minnesota, you'll find your way to the homepage and then click on the Get Our Updates button. So perfect. Okay. What was the purpose of mutton sleeves?
It's such a great, I still don't know. No, it's so funny, isn't it? Those are so huge. And we actually have undergarments that are kind of like little bustles that you put inside of them so that they would help, that you'd kind of tie to your arms so they make your sleeves puff out. But it's one of those things where fashion is not functional necessarily, you know? I mean, it's kind of like, why are there stiletto heels? Or I mean, there's just so much idiosyncrasy to them. And you know, when mutton sleeves were popular, it was a time when women's small waists were very admired. And so the more you have on the top, the smaller your waist looks, more or less. So you're kind of balancing all of that out. And that just happened to be a style. I mean, you can imagine how much a dress, I mean, if you think about, if anybody here is a sewer, and if you have to buy an extra 2 yards of fabric to make big sleeves, that becomes an expense in time and material. But yeah, leg mutton sleeves were a stylistic preference, but certainly did not grow out of a functional need.
Maybe the same thing that brought us the shoulder pads in the 80s
Exactly.
and 90s. I don't know. Thank goodness the mutton sleeves did not come back into fashion then.
Yeah.
So what do you think the museum will be collecting from our era when fast fashion is so important? Will you be shopping at H&M for your pieces?
You know, that's such a good question, and something that we kind of wrestle with, because you know, we can't collect everything. And I have collected a number of things that are more akin to fast fashion from, for example, the 1970s. I have taken a number of double knit polyester pieces that I'm sure were at a lower price point, but represent a very important part of not only our social history, but our technological history, and kind of advancements made and or not, you know, depending on your viewpoint. But it's hard to say how we'll collect what's happening now. I think there'll be a focus somewhat on collecting, what did I say, like protest wear, protest garments. We have, for example, a couple of pussy hats in the collection from the 2017 women's marches, but also just trying to look at how our students are apt to benefit from the pieces that we're taking in. And yet you can't just look at our own lifetime. You know, my time at the Goldstein is in the great scheme of things, you know, small. So how will somebody 30 years from now, what will they want to see? You kind of have to look and think about it from that perspective too.
Perhaps Stanley cups. Don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
What is the earliest piece that you have in the collection?
We have some little tapestries that date to about 1500
Ooh,
that are quite old. And we may have some ceramics that predate that. But you know, our collection is not, it isn't that old. I'm trying to think if there's anything older. In garments, we have one beautiful dress from the late 1700s that was made, the fabric was made by a place called Spitalfields, which is near London, and it's hand embroidered. So things like that are a little more a little older. But for example, I had a student want to look at stays or corsets from the 1700s. Well, we don't have stays. We have corsets from the 1800s, but we don't have anything like that from the 1700s.
oh. All right. How do different design eras come about? For example, the Art Deco era. My limited understanding of things is limited to things like the 60s and how they became so vibrant with color and design, because it was an opening of society, and all different aspects of society and fashion reflected that. But what does Art Deco have to do with depression or pre-depression? Help.
Yeah, Art Deco, if you're taking that as an example, there'd be so many influences ultimately that would kind of inform design. I think of that time as the interwar period, as a time of a lot of prosperity initially in the 20s in the US anyways. Internationally, you have international design, which is this very avant-garde kind of Bauhaus modern design, which is looked to by a lot of the coastal design intelligentsia. But I don't know that would necessarily be integrated into clothing immediately, although we certainly see in the 20s such a different silhouette from the teens, where it's very linear, and we don't see any emphasis on the waist in the 20s. So in a way, that starts to embody many different aspects of culture. But I don't know that you can point to one influence. Women's suffrage in the 20s, certainly they had been building up forever. There had been a lot of actual part of the suffrage movement was tied into actual dress reform movement. There was so much backlash to women wearing, pants or comfortable clothing from women, and both men and women not wanting to kind of shift that norm. That eventually, you'll get outliers that seem so extreme that the people who are just mildly outlying will start to move that way. And so, there's just so many factors. Something like Art Deco, I would say it's strongly informed by European design, which is at that time strongly informed by Asian design, which is, there's just so much cross generation of ideas.
So you can't really say that design influences culture, or that culture influences design. It's kind of the nature nurture thing, I suppose, right? It goes both ways.
I think so. And I think also part of the 20s, we think of globalization as a really contemporary concept. Some of us do, but it's so old. And so, there was a lot of focus on global design in the 20s and global travel. If you think about the exhuming of King Tut's tomb and how something like that, has so much influence. We have pieces in our collection that certainly were made from fabric called, Nile green, or, they're picking up on all kinds of different events taking place worldwide.
Okay, one of our attendees, our listeners, is wondering if you could outline again the fifth area of your collection. You mentioned costumes, textiles, decorative arts, product design, and
graphic design. And
Yeah.
that is an area that have we have a number of runs of, like, Emigre magazine was a very popular kind of niche trade magazine in graphic design for many years throughout the 80s and 90s. And so we'll have like a full run of Emigre or a full run of Portfolio, which was a very limited series from the 1950s, 60s, or these kind of trade particular journals. But it's been a difficult collection to kind of figure out how to collect and use, because of course students, anything they want to see graphic design wise, they Google. So how do you collect every gum wrapper, for example, as an example of graphic design? It becomes complicated. And yet we took a huge amount of graphic design packaging for the Michael Graves Target Corporation collaboration. And we don't have all that photographed yet, but we certainly are interested in collecting it. I think it's just a question of how to use it. I think instructors have a hard time figuring out how to leverage it, as well as students. And I'm not an expert in graphic design. I, know a bit about it, but not that much. And so it's also hard to collect just based on how you need to, collaborate with a specialist to really find out what the right pieces to do that would be.
Okay, this is such a global question. I'll just throw it out there. What makes a design fabulous?
Fabulous. Let's see. That would be very, well, I mean, you could say that. I think it's subjective. Even though we teach design, teach elements of design that might make you, more apt to create fabulous design, that you would, but I think in today's world, you really need to be user-centric and think about, and I think there's different uses. When we talk about use, we often think of functionality of a object, and how good is it at getting what we want done in the quickest amount of time possible. But I think design is a little broader than that. And in my view, I'm sure some people would not think that, but that there's a function to design that's aesthetic. There's a function to design that moves beyond absolute best, logistical functionality, to something that has an aesthetic functionality as well. And I think you see that everywhere, whether people, I mean, how good or bad can a carrot peeler be? Well, it can be good or bad, right? I mean, there's a huge variety. We've all had bad carrot peelers. But at the end of the day, somebody like me, might maybe buy 3 carrot peelers in a 20-year span at the most, So you're really looking at things that lie out. There has to be another hook to it somehow. But it really depends on the thing too. I mean, if you're looking at a stent, you want it to be the best performing stent ever. So it depends on the product category as well.
I have a very cute little fish-shaped carrot peeler that I like. So,
See?
so there you go. Okay, what about the socioeconomic aspects of fashion design? Does your museum address that at all, or plan to?
Well, like I said, I've been collecting some more things as people bring them to me that are lower price point, because I think it's an important sector to represent. It's where most of us sit in our lives. And so that's why, you know, showing those 2 house dresses from the 20s, well, I think those are such important pieces to the collection. It's nice to have Christian Louboutin shoes, but really how many people wear something like that? Not that you still don't want to study that, and a lot of people do. But I do think it's important to look at a wider demographic of design. Now, that being said, you know, you could easily, if everything's relative, then there's no parameters around anything. And how are you going to collect then? So I think that we need to do a better job of thinking about what would make I mean, like I said, we're so receptive to what people give us, but what would make a collection more broadly kind of accessible, both kind of intellectually, visually, how can it relate? I do think that in a design museum, you have a great ability to do that, because everybody eats on dinnerware. Everybody around, not everybody, but most people come in contact with those kinds of everyday objects that we're talking about. And so making sure that we see, for example, in our current exhibition, we have, we're featuring some boats from Urban Boat Builders, which is a organization that helps kids learn a skill, kids that are having a hard way finding avenues into kind of jobs and society. It gives them a woodworking skill and a making skill that they wouldn't otherwise have. So trying to kind of find those points that really amplify the way that design meets everybody and not make people feel excluded from that picture.
Well, I think I've come to the end of the questions that I can ask you. So I want to thank you for this incredible presentation. I can't tell you how many of the comments in the Q&A have come through thanking you for this.
Oh,
And
good.
I love your slides and the colors and the pictures of things. It was delightful. And to thank the listeners as always, because you make up our audience and you come up with these wonderful questions that we have. And I would like to invite everyone, make sure that everyone knows about our next presentation, which is in a week. And as soon as I pull up yes, here it is. Next week, we have a presentation on April 11th called Awesome Apples, Honey Crisps to Kudos with Dr. James Luby, also of the University of Minnesota. So we will look forward to seeing all of you back in a week for more fascinating discussion and presentation. Thanks again, everyone, and thanks to Dr. McElvain. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Thank you so much.